The moment Sarah realized what she'd done, her hands began to shake uncontrollably, trembling with a violence that seemed to come from deep within her core, shaking in a way that she couldn't control no matter how hard she tried to squeeze them into fists. She stood in the middle of the crowded medical tent in the war zone of eastern Kandahar, her body feeling simultaneously too light and too heavy at the same time, as if gravity itself had become negotiable and uncertain. She stared down at the innocuous blue cloth bundle she'd just tied into the metal framework overhead, with a series of deliberate, methodical, careful knots that had taken her 7 full minutes to complete with absolute precision. Her fingers had moved through each movement with the practiced deliberation of someone diffusing an explosive device, because in many ways, that's exactly what she was doing. She'd just detonated something, and the blast radius was going to be enormous. Nobody around her seemed to notice the action itself, which was exactly what she'd intended, exactly what she'd counted on when she planned this out during those 72 hours of sleeplessness. The soldiers were still rushing in and out through the canvas flaps on either side of the tent, their boots leaving trails of fine desert sand on the concrete floor, sand that never seemed to go away no matter how many times people swept. Nurses were still moving methodically through their rounds, checking vital signs on the endless parade of wounded bodies that never seemed to stop coming, a conveyor belt of human suffering that had become so normalized it barely registered on the consciousness anymore. Doctors were still barking orders in that controlled but urgent tone that came from processing human suffering on an industrial scale, from making decisions about life and death in moments when hesitation could be fatal. But Sarah knew with absolute certainty, with a knowledge that went deeper than thought, that in the next few minutes everything around her would change in ways that nobody could predict or control or prepare for adequately. The stupid trick she'd learned during her nursing school's disaster management course, the one her classmates had openly laughed about in the lecture hall, making jokes about how outdated and useless it was, the one she'd dismissed as theatrical nonsense from a bygone era when modern communications didn't exist and military operations looked completely different. The one she'd actually suggested was completely obsolete and pointless in a conversation with her clinical supervisor who'd just nodded. Eden moved on, was about to become the most crucial decision of her entire life, the one thing that would define her entire career and change the trajectory of everything that followed. She hadn't planned to use it here, in this makeshift hospital tent constructed from canvas and aluminum poles that weren't nearly as sturdy as they needed to be for the environment, where supplies were chronically scarce and often arrived damaged or incomplete, and where lives hung by threads so thin they barely seemed real anymore. After weeks of seeing the same patterns repeat over and over, the insurgents were coming. She'd overheard the radio chatter during the morning shift change 3 days ago, had heard the coded language and military jargon being used, had seen the knowing looks exchanged between the military personnel who worked the communication station, understanding with crystalline clarity that she was listening to information she was probably not supposed to hear. She'd come to understand the code words that were embedded in seemingly casual conversations about supply routes and logistical schedules, the subtle indicators that something significant was being planned. They were planning something catastrophically significant and terrible, and this medical tent was somehow central to their entire operation, central to whatever was about to happen. Sarah's mind kept racing back to that disorienting moment 3 weeks ago, when she'd first arrived at this deployment, touching down at the airfield with her single large duffel bag containing everything she owned that she'd brought with her. She'd arrived with an idealistic hope so pure and uncomplicated it seemed almost naive now when she thought back on it, carrying dreams so ambitious they almost seemed delusional, given what she'd encountered since then. She'd come here to save lives, motivated by every humanitarian instinct she possessed, believing with an almost religious fervor that her nursing skills and her willingness to work shifts that lasted 18, 19, sometimes 22 hours would somehow matter in the grand calculus of war, would somehow shift the balance between suffering and healing. But war had a devastating way of stripping away your illusions like paint remover on old wood, peeling away layers of idealism and replacing them with harsh realities and impossible choices that your training never adequately prepared you for, that no amount of classroom education could have warned you about properly. Now, as she completed the final knot in that blue cloth, the one piece of fabric that nobody in a medical environment would think twice about seeing hanging from a support pole, the one object that wouldn't trigger any alarms or suspicion or investigation, something so ordinary that it would blend seamlessly into the background, She realized with crystalline clarity that her actions might either save dozens of innocent people who were currently being processed through the system, or mark the beginning of the worst day of her professional career, the worst decision she'd ever made in a moment of desperation. The question that dominated her consciousness, repeating obsessively in her mind, was whether she'd executed her plan correctly, with enough precision and clarity that someone would actually understand what she'd done, would decode the signal correctly, and take appropriate action. And perhaps more importantly than anything else, would anyone with the actual power to act on that information understand what the signal meant before it was too late, before the convoy had already departed, and the prisoners had already disappeared into the black sites from which they would never return as conscious human beings? Every nurse dreams about the moment they'll make a real difference, the moment that defines their entire career, and becomes the story they tell at dinner parties and professional conferences for the rest of their life. I'm here to tell you the true story of Sarah Mitchell, a trauma nurse whose quick thinking and instinctive decision-making in the face of genuinely impossible circumstances saved the lives of 43 human beings and exposed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military intelligence, a conspiracy so dark and so complex that the government has spent years trying to keep it classified and hidden from public view. What you're about to hear isn't something you'll find in official government reports or mainstream media coverage, because major news outlets have been discouraged from investigating this story or pursuing leads related to it. This is the story that military officials actively tried to keep buried through means both subtle and explicit, using pressure and intimidation and legal threats against anyone who tried to make the truth public. This is the story that reveals what really happened inside that medical tent on August 15, 2019, the specific date when everything changed and nothing would ever be the same again. Sarah's decision that day, the one that everyone initially called reckless and foolish and completely against every protocol and regulation in existence, became the turning point that changed everything about how this operation was understood and prosecuted, and how accountability was ultimately assigned. By the time you finish watching this entire video, every single word of it, you'll understand exactly why a stupid trick from nursing school, something taught as a historical curiosity in a single afternoon lecture, became an act of extraordinary courage under conditions that most people will never experience or even be able to imagine properly. But before we dive into the intricate details of what happened that fateful morning, before we explore the specific mechanisms of how this conspiracy operated and who exactly was involved, I want to hear from you directly. Want you to connect with me and with this community. Drop a comment down below and tell me exactly what city you're watching this from right now. Are you watching from New York City, that sprawling metropolis on the East Coast? London, with its ancient streets and modern complexity? Sydney on the other side of the world where this story might seem impossibly far away? Tokyo, where military corruption takes on different forms and shapes? Maybe you're somewhere completely unexpected, somewhere most people have never heard of, somewhere remote or isolated. I read every single comment that comes through on this channel, and the international nature of this community never ceases to amaze me on a personal level, never stops making me realize how connected we all are despite our physical distance. The stories people have and the places they're watching from create this incredible global perspective on events that affect all of us. So go ahead, take 30 seconds and tell me where you're tuning in from, because every comment helps me understand who's out there connecting with these stories and what resonates with people across different countries and cultures and backgrounds. And once you've left that comment, once you've told me where you are, stick around as we uncover exactly how a single nurse's unconventional thinking and willingness to trust her instincts and her knowledge exposed a plot that nobody saw coming, a conspiracy so intricate and so well protected that it took someone with courage to break it open. This is a story about heroes who don't wear combat uniforms, about ordinary people making extraordinary decisions under extraordinary pressure, and about the real price of following your instincts and your conscience when everything and everyone around you says you're completely wrong and tells you to stay quiet. Sarah Mitchell had been volunteering with the United States Army Medical Corps for exactly 219 days when she realized with sudden, overwhelming clarity that the real enemy wasn't always the one you could see coming from across the battlefield on the horizon, the one that fired weapons and sent casualties streaming into your medical facility. She'd spent her first 3 months at Forward Operating Base Helmand, telling herself repeatedly that she was exactly where she needed to be in her life, that her nursing degree and her willingness to work shifts that lasted until her hands cramped and her vision blurred from fatigue, were genuinely making a measurable difference in the lives of soldiers who'd been torn apart by the violence surrounding them in every direction, violence that was constant and relentless and inescapable. The medical tent had become her entire world, had consumed her entire existence, had become everything she thought about when she closed her eyes at night and tried to sleep despite her exhaustion. It was a canvas structure held up by aluminum poles and human determination, a temporary structure that felt more permanent than anything in her life had ever been, where the smell of antiseptic chemicals and human blood had become so familiar that she barely noticed it anymore after the first few weeks of her deployment. It was the smell of institutional medicine, mixed with the acrid smell of sweat and fear and hopelessness. The smell of survival and death coexisting in the same physical space. It was the sand that got to you in ways that nothing else could, nothing that any amount of training or preparation could have warned you about adequately. The sand that infiltrated every single supply box that came through the fob, every bandage and every first aid kit, every conceivable crevice of the facility with microscopic persistence that seemed almost alive in its relentlessness. Sarah had developed a habit over weeks of letting her mind wander during her rare moments of rest, to memories of rainy Oregon during her off hours, of the quiet weekend mornings before she'd signed up for active deployment, when she could sleep past 5 in the morning. Back when her biggest worry had been whether she'd get a shift promotion at the civilian hospital where she'd worked after graduation and earned her credentials. She'd arrived at the medical tent that morning at 05:30 hours, 2 hours before the official shift change was scheduled to happen, arriving before almost anyone else was awake or moving around the FOB. This had become her standard practice because that's what dedicated nurses did when they cared about maintaining continuity of patient care and ensuring nothing fell through the cracks during shift transitions. There was a particular major she'd been working closely with for the previous weeks, observing him carefully and noting patterns in his behavior, Major Thomas Hendricks, who seemed to carry the weight of the entire operation on his shoulders like some kind of impossible burden that was slowly crushing him under its pressure. She'd noticed something profoundly off about him 3 weeks prior, something that didn't quite fit the pattern, something that set off alarm bells in her mind despite having no concrete evidence. The way his eyes would dart around the tent with what seemed like suspicion and paranoia, the way he seemed far more interested in the logistics of medication storage and supply chain management than in actual patient care or medical outcomes, the way he would ask detailed and specific questions about supply chain procedures that seemed oddly specific and unusual for someone in his position. It wasn't anything concrete enough to report through official channels without risking her credibility, but it was there, sitting in her gut like bad food, causing a constant, low-level nausea that she couldn't quite shake, no matter how many times she tried to rationalize it away or convince herself she was imagining things. The morning of August 12th started like any other morning in the medical tent, with the routine tasks that formed the backbone of healthcare delivery in austere conditions where resources were limited, and every decision mattered enormously. Sarah arrived at 05:30 hours as she had been doing consistently for weeks, establishing a pattern that seemed unremarkable and normal to everyone around her. She began her pre-shift routine of checking supply inventories with meticulous care, verifying that everything was where it should be, and preparing the medication stations for the incoming day. She wasn't supposed to be there yet, officially speaking, wasn't yet on the clock for the current shift. The night shift nurse, Lieutenant Jennifer Parker, was still an hour away from clocking out and completing her detailed handoff report and briefing the incoming staff on any significant events or patient changes from the night. Sarah had let herself in using her standard access card, a credential she'd received on her first day of deployment, a plastic card that granted her access to most areas of the FOB. As she was walking toward the supply station at the back of the tent, moving with purpose and trying to look like she belonged there, she heard voices coming from somewhere deeper in the structure, not the normal sounds of the facility that she'd become accustomed to after weeks of immersion, sounds of machines and movement and controlled urgency. These were hushed, urgent conversations that were clearly meant to be private, conversations being conducted in low tones designed to avoid being overheard, coming from the small office area that was cordoned off by heavy canvas dividers that didn't fully muffle sound, that allowed quiet voices to carry through the fabric if you listened carefully. The paperwork is clean, completely legitimate looking, absolutely beyond reproach, she heard Major Hendricks saying. His voice was tight, constricted, almost whispered, with an edge of tension that made her immediately alert and put her on guard. This wasn't his normal tone of voice. This was the voice of someone engaged in deception, someone under significant stress. Nobody's going to question it at the checkpoint. I've verified this personally. The documentation will pass every inspection. Another voice responded, one she didn't recognize and couldn't quite place, speaking with an accent she couldn't immediately identify, despite her training in picking up subtle linguistic markers. The voice belonged to a man. That much she could determine, but the accent suggested someone not from North America or Europe. Middle Eastern, perhaps? Central Asian? She couldn't be certain. Shipment comes through on supply run 17. That's confirmed for tomorrow. The coordination is extremely tight. There's absolutely no room for any complications whatsoever. If this goes wrong, if there's any deviation from the plan, people die. Do you understand the stakes here? Sarah's breath had caught in her throat like she'd been physically struck across the face. She'd stopped walking immediately, pressing herself against one of the support poles in the tent, her body going rigid with tension, her heart hammering against her ribs so forcefully she was certain it would give away her position to anyone listening carefully. Her mind raced, trying to process what she was hearing, trying to connect the pieces. 43 of what? 43 what? The question repeated in her mind with obsessive intensity, demanding an answer. 43 of them is confirmed, the stranger continued, answering the unasked question hanging in the air as if he'd been reading her thoughts. The coordination is tight. No room for complications. We've been planning this for 18 months. Everything is aligned. The money is allocated, the transportation is arranged, everything is in place. Sarah felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. Her mouth went completely dry. The sensation was physically disorienting, like being on a boat in rough water, like losing her sense of equilibrium. She had to grab the tent pole to steady herself. The medical tent provides perfect cover for everything we need, the stranger continued, his voice taking on a conversational tone as if he were discussing something as mundane as the weather or scheduling. Nobody questions supplies coming in and out of here. People expect chaos and constant movement. The paperwork is already doctored. By tomorrow evening we'll be completely gone and your cut will be waiting in Dubai in a secure account. $500,000. Non-traceable. Untaxed. Yours to keep. She had stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 90 seconds in real time. 130 seconds of her life that seemed to stretch into infinity. Long enough to understand that something catastrophic was being planned. Something organized. Something that involved the medical facility as a central component to the operation. Something that involved supply runs and falsified documents and money being funneled to offshore accounts in ways designed to avoid detection. Long enough to realize that Major Hendricks, a high-ranking officer in the U.S. Army, was somehow complicit in whatever was happening, that he was being compensated handsomely for his participation, that he'd apparently been recruited into this conspiracy and was profiting significantly from it, and long enough to understand that she couldn't walk back to her secure area, contact someone through official channels, and report what she'd heard through proper military procedures, because whoever was on the other end of that conversation would immediately know that someone had been listening and would adapt accordingly, would implement contingency plans designed to eliminate the threat. The question that paralyzed her, the one that kept her frozen against that pole that prevented her from moving or acting or even breathing normally, was whether the person she reported to could be trusted, or whether the corruption ran so deep that reporting it would put her own life in immediate danger. In a military operation, in a war zone, in a place where the normal rules of civilian society didn't apply, information was everything. And information about corruption from command staff, information about human trafficking and illegal detention, was the kind of thing that could be weaponized against you if you reported it to the wrong person, if you trusted the wrong individual with this knowledge. Sarah had backed away carefully, letting her footfalls make deliberate noise on the concrete floor so that they'd know someone was approaching before she came around the corner, so they wouldn't be startled or alarmed by a sudden appearance that might trigger a violent response. She could see Major Hendricks quickly shuffling some papers on his desk with obvious nervousness, his hands moving with jerky, uncoordinated motions that betrayed his internal panic. She could see the flash of genuine panic crossing his face like a storm front moving across the landscape, a visible manifestation of his fear and concern about what information might have been overheard. The man standing with him, dressed in dark civilian clothes despite being inside a military facility in a war zone where such clothing was unusual and drew attention, was already moving rapidly toward the back exit, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone trained in rapid extraction and evasion. By the time she'd rounded the corner fully, trying to make her expression blank and neutral as if she'd noticed nothing unusual. The stranger was completely gone, vanished like he'd never been there at all, leaving behind only the fading echo of his presence. Only Major Hendricks remained, his face now composed into something resembling normalcy, though she could see the sweat on his upper lip and the tremor in his hands as he pretended to organize papers that didn't need organizing. "Mitchell," he'd said, his voice remarkably steady despite his obvious panic and internal distress. "You're here early this morning, earlier than usual." "Couldn't sleep," she'd replied, matching his casual tone and trying to seem unbothered and normal. "Too much noise from the generators they were running all night. Thought I might get ahead on morning prep. Catch up on some organizational tasks." He'd nodded slowly, his eyes watching her with laser focus, trying to assess whether she'd heard anything incriminating, trying to determine whether she constituted a threat to his operation, or whether she could be managed or dismissed as simply an eager-to-please junior staff member. "That's initiative. I appreciate your dedication to this facility, and to the work we do here, though you should be careful about working off the clock. Regulations, you know. They exist for a reason. Even if your intentions are good, I can't have people working without proper oversight." But she'd seen something in his eyes then, something that told her he was assessing her as a potential threat, trying to determine whether she'd picked up on any part of the conversation he'd been having. Something that suggested her safety had just moved into a precarious new category, that she'd transitioned in his mind from being an invisible junior staff member to someone who might need to be managed or eliminated to protect his interests. And as she'd gone through the rest of that morning, preparing medications and checking on patients, trying to act completely normal despite her racing thoughts and her internal panic, she'd known with absolute certainty that whatever was about to happen would occur very soon, probably within the next several days or even hours. And when it did, the body count would dwarf anything they'd seen so far in terms of magnitude and tragedy. She'd tried to calculate the numbers, tried to understand what 43 packages could contain, what 43 prisoners being disappeared into a black site in Pakistan would mean for their families, for the legal system, for any possibility of justice or accountability. The question that would haunt her constantly, the question that would drive her to take the action she took 3 days later, was straightforward, but terrifying. What exactly were they moving through that supply run scheduled for tomorrow? What were those 43 packages that Major Hendricks and his associate had been discussing with such casual brutality? Were they weapons destined for hostile forces? Were they drugs being smuggled through military supply chains? Were they something else entirely? Something even more sinister than she could initially imagine? And perhaps more importantly than anything else, what was Major Hendricks really planning to do with 43 of whatever it was once they arrived at the FOB? Was he simply facilitating their transport, or was he actively involved in whatever happened to them after they arrived? The not knowing was almost worse than the knowing would have been, and the uncertainty gnawed at her relentlessly, occupying her thoughts every moment she wasn't actively engaged in patient care. 72 hours later, standing in her small quarters on the FOB late at night, Sarah was still operating on perhaps 2 hours of sleep total accumulated across the 3 entire days since she'd overheard the conversation. She'd spent those 72 hours in a state of controlled panic, constantly documenting everything she could about supply runs and their timing patterns and the specific vehicles that were used, carefully watching Major Hendricks' movements and interactions with other personnel, trying to understand the full scope of what was being planned, trying to figure out exactly what she was going to do with the information she'd gathered, without putting herself in immediate danger or making herself a target. She couldn't go to the military police directly because Major Hendricks held enough authority within the command structure that he could spin any accusation into a convenient narrative about a junior nurse who was experiencing combat stress and becoming increasingly paranoid from the strain of the deployment, about a medical professional who'd been working too many hours and had developed conspiracy theories as a result of sleep deprivation. She'd seen it happen before to someone else, someone she knew personally, someone who'd questioned higher-ranking officers about irregularities she'd noticed in supply deliveries and inventory discrepancies that didn't make sense. That person had ended up medically evacuated, with a diagnosis of acute adjustment disorder and combat-related psychological stress, their career essentially destroyed, and their credibility completely undermined, sent to a psychiatric facility where her protests were recorded as paranoid delusions rather than legitimate concerns. The night of August 14th, unable to sleep despite her complete exhaustion, Despite her body screaming for rest, she'd been reviewing the emergency protocols manual she'd brought from her nursing school, the thick binder of procedures and contingency plans that seemed almost comical in their optimism and their assumptions about the scenarios they were preparing for. Most of them were designed around natural disasters or large-scale accidents or scenarios that were almost unrealistic in their complexity. Scenarios that assumed a functioning support system and reliable communications and authority structures that could be trusted. But on page 187, buried deep within a section about hospital evacuation procedures and emergency protocols and disaster response procedures, was a procedure called the silent alert system. She remembered her instructor mentioning it only vaguely, remembered it being taught in a single afternoon lecture that came toward the end of the semester, when most students were already thinking about finals, rather than the material being presented. It had been developed during the Cold War era by military medical planners who were concerned about scenarios where normal communications might be compromised or sabotaged, scenarios where certain threats needed to be communicated without alerting hostile forces to the fact that medical personnel were aware of the threat, situations where electronic communications might be monitored or intercepted by enemies. The procedure involved color-coded cloth signals hung in specific, predetermined locations throughout a medical facility, signals that had been standardized across military medical installations during the 1960s and 1970s. A blue cloth hung from the central support structure meant potential active combatant threat had been identified inside the secure perimeter, meaning that hostile military personnel had infiltrated the facility or were planning an imminent attack. A red cloth meant medical emergency requiring immediate evacuation of certain patient populations, meaning that the medical facility itself was in danger and evacuation protocols needed to be activated immediately. The system had been considered archaic, almost laughable in modern contexts, dismissed as methodology from an era before modern electronics existed, before secure radio systems and electronic alert systems that could be activated instantly. Hospitals had largely abandoned it in favor of radio communications and electronic alert systems that could be activated instantly and communicated to multiple recipients simultaneously, with guaranteed delivery and instant notification. Her nursing school instructor had included it only for historical context, had actually used it as a textbook example of outdated methodology that had been replaced by modern technological solutions that were infinitely more effective and efficient and reliable. She'd taught it in a way that made it clear this was obsolete information, that no one actually used these systems anymore, that modern medicine had evolved beyond such primitive communication methods. Most of her classmates had found it humorous, had made jokes during the lecture about how quaint and useless such systems were in an age of instant digital communication and satellite phones and internet connectivity. Sarah had even joined in the laughter, had dismissed it at the time as completely pointless information that would never be relevant to her career. But modern solutions required people you could trust completely, people whose integrity and loyalty you could rely on, people who wouldn't use the information against you or manipulate it for their own purposes. And Sarah didn't know who she could trust anymore. The chain of command had been compromised at some level, contaminated by corruption from within. Trust had become a luxury she couldn't afford to indulge. An alert system that didn't rely on any technology that could be intercepted or monitored, that didn't require her to speak to anyone or identify herself in any way, that couldn't be traced back to her or used against her, suddenly seemed like it might be her only viable option in this situation. It was the only method available to her that might trigger a response from people who still embodied the principles she believed in. The Supply Run 17 was officially scheduled for 1400 hours on August 15th, the very next day. Sarah had verified this information by carefully reviewing the logistics board when she knew Major Hendricks wasn't watching, had double-checked against the supply manifests she'd managed to photograph with her phone in moments when she was alone in the supply office, taking quick snapshots when she was absolutely certain no one was observing her actions. 21 vehicles would arrive in a convoy according to the manifest, a significant transport operation that would require coordination. The official documentation said they were bringing fresh supplies to replenish inventory, blood products for the medical tent to support ongoing operations, and medical equipment for various departments that had been requesting upgrades. But Sarah had cross-referenced the manifest against what they'd actually consumed and used in the past week, what their historical usage patterns showed based on weekly records she'd accessed through the inventory system, and the numbers didn't match at all. They were receiving 3 times the normal supply of blood products despite the patient census being unusually low for this time of year. They were receiving 4 times the normal medication delivery, far exceeding what could possibly be stored in the existing supply areas. They were receiving completely unnecessary quantities of sterile packaging materials that had no clear medical application or use case. Materials that had no reason to be ordered in such massive quantities. Unless those packages weren't meant to carry medical supplies at all. Unless they were meant to contain something else entirely. Something that required special handling and protection. Something valuable or fragile or dangerous. The implications were staggering. She'd arrived early that morning at 500 hours. Even earlier than her new habit of arriving at 5:30 hours, arriving in the pre-dawn darkness before almost anyone else was moving around the fob. The tent was quiet, the night shift nurses moving through their final rounds before the morning changeover, completing their last patient assessments and preparing their handoff reports. Sarah had made her way deliberately to the supply closet where cleaning materials were kept, had removed a pristine blue cotton cloth from the shelving, the exact kind of cloth used for sterilizing surfaces in medical environments, the kind of cloth that no one would question seeing anywhere in a medical facility. Methodically, carefully, with hands that didn't shake despite her racing pulse and her absolute terror about what she was about to do, she'd tied it to the top center support pole of the medical tent using a series of secure knots, positioning it so firmly and securely that it would take deliberate effort and significant time to remove it. She'd used the knots she'd learned in nursing school. The same ones used to secure bandages and medical equipment, knots that would hold firm under stress and tension. The blue cloth hung there, visible to anyone who looked up, innocuous and ordinary, blending seamlessly into the background. Just another piece of fabric in a medical environment where such things were ubiquitous. Major Hendricks arrived at the tent at 11:30 hours, 30 minutes earlier than his usual schedule, which in itself was suspicious and indicated that something in his plan had changed. Or accelerated. She watched his face very carefully as he scanned the tent systematically, his eyes moving from section to section in a pattern that suggested he was looking for something specific. He saw the blue cloth immediately, saw it the moment he entered the tent, his eyes drawn to it like a compass needle pointing north. She watched him see it. His entire body went rigid with shock and what appeared to be genuine panic, his muscles tensing, his breath seemingly catching in his throat. He stood there, completely statue still, a man carved from stone, for what felt like an infinite stretch of time, probably only 5 or 10 seconds in reality, but feeling like an eternity. Then with movements that seemed deliberate and controlled despite his obvious internal distress, he walked backward toward the exit, his eyes never leaving the blue cloth, left the tent without speaking to anyone or attempting to conceal his concern. She heard him on his radio, his voice urgent but encoded in a way that suggested military protocol. The package is visible. I say again, the package is visible. We need to move schedule up to 1200 hours immediately. Repeat, immediate. Accelerate the operation. Everything moves forward now. Sarah's heart had nearly stopped completely in her chest, ceasing its rhythmic beating for a moment that felt like an eternity. She'd done it. She'd activated the alert. She'd successfully communicated the signal that she believed no one would notice or understand. But she suddenly realized with crushing force that she didn't know if anyone was actually monitoring for an archaic Cold War alert system. If anyone at the FOB even remembered this forgotten protocol still existed in the modern military context, if she just made a terrible miscalculation that was about to get people killed instead of saving them. The uncertainty was paralyzing, was overwhelming, was consuming her thoughts completely. The vehicles began arriving 45 minutes early, at 12:15 hours, rolling through the checkpoint in a tight convoy formation. And that's when she found out that Major Hendricks was only one small piece of a much, much larger operation. An operation that was about to be exposed in ways that nobody involved had been prepared for or anticipated.